Okay, so today's daf is actually daf kaf. We're going to start on Yud Tet Amud Bet at the bottom of the page with the new Mishnah. And Tzolin Basar Batal Betza Elekdeshi Tzolmi Ba'od Yom says that we can't roast meat or an onion or egg unless it's going to be fully roasted while it is still daytime. In other words, we can't leave it to cook into Shabbat on Friday afternoon. Ein notnin pat letanur im chashecha. We cannot put bread into the oven at nightfall. We can't put a kind of a cake or a kind of a biscuit on the coals unless it's going to form a crust while it is still daytime, which means to say that the essential cooking has to be done. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Kadeshi Yikroma Tachton Shela. He says only when the bottom of it becomes crusted. We're going to see what exactly that means, whether that's a stringency of Rabbi Eliezer, or whether Rabbi Eliezer is coming to be more lenient than the Chachamim. In other words, is what Rabbi Eliezer is saying, that the bottom of it needs to form a crust, and that's the earliest crust that it forms, or does he mean that even the bottom crust has to be formed in the top and the bottom? So we're going to see shortly how to interpret that. So if Erev Pesach would be on Friday, so Pesach is Friday night, so then they would be offering the Korban Pesach on Friday, and they would be eating it on Friday night. So they could lower the, they would have the Korban Pesach, and they would have to roast it whole. So they would lower it into the oven. Mishal Shalin, they would have, they would be hanging it over the fire. Im chashecha, even at nightfall. We're going to see why that is. Why is there an exception to the rule? We just said that we shouldn't be putting the meat right on the fire right before nightfall unless it's going to be cooked. But with the Korban Pesach, there is apparently an exception to the rule. And similarly, we can light a fire in the Bet HaMoked. The Bet HaMoked was where the Kohanim would heat themselves. Remember, the Kohanim had to walk around barefoot in the Bet HaMikdash because their feet had to touch the stone floor. The stone floor, especially in the evenings in Yerushalayim, especially in the fall and winter time, can be very cold, and so therefore their feet are very chilly, and they're working there at night. So they would go into the Bet HaMoked, which was a heated room. It had a big fire, and that was how they would warm their feet and warm their body during the cold times of the year when they had to walk around without any shoes or socks. So you're allowed to light that Bet HaMoked fire even right before Shabbat started. So normally, ubigvulin, as we turn to Daf Kaf Amud Aleph, in outside of the Bet HaMikdash, that you have to, if you're going to light a fire on Erev Shabbat in your home, if you're going to light a fire on Erev Shabbat, let's say in your fireplace at home, it has to be that the majority of whatever the fuel is, the logs or whatever, have caught fire before Shabbat starts. You can't just throw a match in and hope that it's going to catch fire. Why not? Obvious reason. Because what happens if the fire doesn't catch? Then you're going to be tempted to play around with the logs a little bit in order to stimulate the fire and get it going. We don't want that to happen. So it has to be, if you're going to light a fire in your home, that you light it with ample time, that you make sure that enough of the logs have caught fire for the fire to be sustained. That is not true in the Bet HaMikdash. In the Bet HaMikdash, they had a leniency that they could light it right before Shabbat, no problem. We're going to see why. Rabbi Yehuda says, similarly, if you light a charcoal fire, all you need to do is light one, and you can be confident that the fire will continue, because charcoal is such that it's not going to extinguish easily. The way that it burns, it has a sustained burning. So we're not concerned that it's going to start flickering out and you're going to play with the coals. So these are various halachot where even according to Beit Hillel, now we know Beit Shammai has a stringent opinion about starting melachot that are going to extend into Shabbat. But even Beit Hillel is going to say, don't do these things right before Shabbat, because if they have not taken and they haven't become stable, these situations before Shabbat, we're concerned that you're going to intervene and you're going to stoke the coals or play with the logs or whatever on Shabbat itself, and thus desecrate Shabbat. So now we move into the Gemara. The Gemara says, V'chama, and how much? What is V'chama? What is the how much? He's asking, you said before that in order to roast meat or an egg or an onion on Friday, you want to roast it, it has to be roasted while it's still daytime. You cannot let it roast into Shabbat. And again, not because the malacha that you started, if it continues into Shabbat, it's credited to you. That's not, we don't hold like Beit Shammai. But because if we leave it in that situation, we're concerned that it might not cook as quickly as you planned, as thoroughly as you wanted, and you're going to play with the fire to adjust it. So how cooked does it have to be? Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rav. Rabbi Elazar said that Rav said, that it has to cook according to the level of ma'achal ben derusai. Some people say this means a third of the cooking, which is what Rashi says. Some say it means a half cooked. Whatever it is, ben derusai was a robber, and because he was a robber, he was always on the run. And people on the run don't have much time to wait for their food to cook fully. So ben derusai would always eat his food either a third cooked or half cooked. The point was that it was rare, we would say. In other words, it was cooked enough to be edible, but not quite cooked enough to be gourmet. It's not exactly what you would prefer for your meal, but it's passable in terms of edibility standards. So that amount is considered cooked. So as long as your food is kemachal ben derusai, it is cooked to the level that it will, it's edible, that's cooked enough. So if it's cooked to the point of edibility before Shabbat, you can leave it on there to complete the cooking process. Itmar Nami, we similarly said it, Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Asi said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Kol shul kemachal ben derusai en bo bishul bishulei nochrim. We have a halacha that a Jew has to do cooking, right? Bishul Yisrael. We know that we can't have bishul akum or bishul nochri, as it says here. So a Jew has to do the cooking of most foods, let's say. Not all foods, but most. So if a food is already kemachal ben derusai, it's already cooked to the point of edibility. So even if a non-Jew takes over the cooking and completes the process, it's no problem. And Tanya Hananya Omer Koshu kemachal ben derusai mutar la'ashoto al gabei kira v'afal pi she'en gerufa u'ktuma. And similarly, Hananya says, as we're going to learn in the third parak Kira. Parak Kira is the next parak of Masekhet Shabbat. We're going to learn there about Hananya's argument with the other rabbis. Hananya says that anything which is the level of kemachal ben derusai, that it is cooked at least 1/3 or a half cooked, one can leave it over the stove to continue to cook, even though the stove is not gerufa u'ktuma, even though you haven't removed the fuel and you haven't covered it with ashes. Because as we're going to learn in Perek Kira, the halacha is that if you want to leave food cooking over Shabbat over the stove, you have to remove the fuel. You have to remove, let's say they would use various kinds of things that they would burn in the stove, and you would have to remove that and you would have to cover with ashes in order to make sure that nobody would come to stoke the coals or play around with the fire over Shabbat. Nowadays we have something called the blech that people use, which is basically a substitute for this idea of grufa u'ktuma. But a person needs to.
Is that Yiddish word?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, sorry. I don't know. Even Chacham Ovadia.
Actually, blech is German for tin.
Is it? Yeah, even Chacham Ovadia uses that term. I don't know that.
Blech in German means tin.
It's whatever the proper word is, whatever you want to call it. But the point is, it's not really, because the plata is something else. So, I don't want to confuse things. But anyway, the point is that if you were to remove the fuel and cover it, then you could leave food simmering over the remaining warmth there is. But if it's kemachal ben derusai, you don't need to, according to Hananya, and that's why many people will put their dafina or their chalent, they put it on the pot. There are two ways to do it. One is to put it right before Shabbat, so that's the best way actually, because everybody agrees that you can put a raw meat over the fire on Erev Shabbat, and it's no problem to cook it into Shabbat if you put it, let's say, within a half hour of Shabbat starting. Others say no, put it in earlier actually, so it's at least a third cooked or a half cooked before you come into Shabbat. That's kemachal ben derusai, and that's another opinion. That's the opinion of Hananya. Now it happens to be that according to Sfaradim, we don't hold like Hananya in that respect, so it's better for us to put in the raw tafina right before Shabbat than to have it cooking in advance of Shabbat. But anyway, that's another story. The point was here to show that kemachal ben derusai, that something which is this level of cooked is edible. We no longer are concerned that you're going to play with the coals, and if the food has already started cooking over those coals on Friday, we can, and if it's reached that point of edibility, you're allowed to leave it there on Shabbat. Now, it would seem though that according to the Rambam and those who don't hold like Hananya, that this would not be the case and would have to be fully cooked in order to do it. Ibailu, they asked the following question. Tachton ha'ech degabe tanur or dilma tachton ha'ech degabe ha'or. So we mentioned before that according to Rabbi Eliezer, the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer had a machloket, they had an argument. According to the Chachamim, the bread that stuck, remember, they would stick their bread to the side of the oven. That's how they cooked it. So the Chachamim said that you can only put bread in the oven on Erev Shabbat only if the face of the bread is going to become crust, but while it's still daytime. That's considered sufficiently cooked that you can leave it there into Shabbat. However, Rabbi Eliezer said no. He said that the bottom of it has to be cooked. So what is the bottom of it? What is he talking about? Does that mean the part that's stuck on the tanur? The part that it's, in other words, if you think of this dough, it's actually stuck to the wall of the oven. So the part that's stuck to the oven wall, is that what he means by the bottom? Or does he mean by the bottom the part that's sticking out and that's over the flame? Because the flame was here. Okay, the flame was perpendicular to the bread. The bread is hanging on the side of the wall. It's stuck to the side of the wall. It's hanging over the flame. So the bottom of the bread, does that mean the bottom that's facing the wall of the oven? Or does that mean the bottom with respect to the fire? The part that's hanging over the fire is the bottom. Now what's the difference? Right. So according to Rashi, so there's somewhat of a discussion about this between Rashi and Tosafot here. But let's just go with Rashi to make it simpler, because otherwise it can get unwieldy. Tosafot and Rashi have a machloket about this. Rashi says that the part that's over the fire is the one that's going to cook first. Okay, he says that that's the part that crusts over first. So where does he say that? In the Rashi, that's דגבי תנור שהכיכרות נדבקים בדופני התנור סביב ולקח מבעיה לעיקרי תחתון הנח פנים דגבי דופני התנור או הפנים הפונים למטה לחלות תנור לצד האור. So he says בחומרה, if you say that it's the one מדובקים בתנור, if you say that it's the part that's stuck to the wall, that's a חומרה. The panim sheklavei or memarin lakrom, that the one that's over the fire actually becomes crusted first. So therefore, if he meant by the bottom of the bread, the part of the bread that's hanging over the fire, that's a leniency. That means that Rabbi Eliezer is saying that all you need is for that part to be crusted, the part that crusts first, and the Chachamim are saying no, the whole thing has to be crusted. But if you say that what Rabbi Eliezer was talking about was that the bottom of the bread that's attached to the wall has to be crusted, that means that he's saying the entire thing needs to be crusted. And the Chachamim are the ones who are saying that no, only the top that's over the flame has to be crusted. So it depends who's being lenient and who's being mahmir. So Tashma, come and listen. Rabbi Eliezer hamidubakin batanur. So according to Rashi's interpretation, what this means is that according to Rabbi Eliezer, the entire bread has to be crusted, both the part that's hanging over the fire and the part that is stuck to the wall of the tanur, that's stuck to the wall of the oven. And that would mean that the Chachamim are saying that all you need is that the part of the bread that's hanging over the fire is crusted. That they're the lenient ones according to this. And then the halakha would follow the Chachamim, and we would follow the lenient view. That's the way that Rashi interprets it. Rabbeinu, the Tosafot here has the opposite reading. Okay, so you have a machloket in terms of understanding this. So we said that we can put the Korban Pesach to cook, even though normally we're not supposed to put meat over the fire unless it's going to be significantly cooked while it's still daytime. We can hang the Korban Pesach into the tanur, into the oven, even right before Shabbat. So, what's the reason? Because the members of the Chavurah, those who are taking care of the Korban Pesach, are zirizin. They are very meticulous. Halav achila. But if not for that, we wouldn't allow it. In other words, that would seem to be the case. The implication is that we only allow this for Korban Pesach. Because when it comes to Korban Pesach, the people that you put in charge of Korban Pesach are good religious people that know what they're doing, and they're not going to come to adjust the flame on Shabbat. But an average person in a normal situation, we're going to be concerned. So then the Gemara asks, Halav achila, is it really true? So then in no other case can you put a sheep, because remember, it's a lamb or a sheep that you're using for the Korban Pesach, correct? So does that mean that in your own home you cannot put this lamb to cook right before Shabbat? But the master said, didn't you remember just a daf or two ago we learned that when it comes to cooking lamb, cooking a sheep, you can actually put the sheep in the oven right before Shabbat and let it cook into Shabbat. And we're not concerned. Even if you didn't seal the oven, we're not concerned. You know why? Because opening the oven door When the wind comes in, it will ruin the meat. It will ruin the meat. So therefore, we're not concerned that you're going to open the oven door to stoke the fire, because if you open the oven door, you're going to ruin the meat. So that should really apply to any case of a sheep, not just the Korban Pesach. Any case of a sheep, you can put it in before Shabbat. So what's the answer? Hatam. So it says Hatam over there, minatach. Hachal lo minatach. Over there, it's cut up, and because the meat is cut up. So therefore, if you open the door of the tanur, if you open the door of the oven, it's going to cool it, I guess, to the point that it's not going to fully cook. But when it comes to a full, remember, the Korban Pesach, when it's roasted completely. Rosh al karav al kirbo, the entire thing together. So it's roasted as the whole big, the entire sheep is roasted as one. So there, opening the oven door wouldn't necessarily ruin the cooking, I guess, because it will retain the heat because it's so big. So the opening door is not going to affect it. So therefore, if you were to cook in your home an entire sheep the way that they cook the Korban Pesach, all at once, you're roasting it, you wouldn't be able to do that right before Shabbat, unless it was significantly through the process of cooking before Shabbat started. However, if you were to cook it cut up in pieces, then even in your own home, you could do it right before Shabbat. The exception to the rule is that when a Korban Pesach is concerned, even though you're cooking it as one whole entity, it's not cut up into pieces, you're still allowed to do it right before Shabbat, because we trust the Bnei Chavurah, we trust those who are responsible, who are charged with taking care of the Korban Pesach, that they are going to not stoke the coals.
Would it be harmed or not harmed if it's cut into pieces?
Apparently it would be harmed if it's cut into pieces. That's why we're not concerned that you're going to open the door.
But that's the same thing that if it's there whole.
No, because if it's whole, they're saying that it would not normally be harmed.
It would not be harmed.
Right. So that's why in your home you wouldn't be able to do it.
Oh, and that was the case that we learned.
The one we learned before was the cut up.
Cut up.
That was cut up. Yeah. So that's good.
Korban Pesach, they use the plural.
Right.
So
Rishal Shalim. Yeah, there's more than one person.
But there was more than one person.
Yeah, it's a chavura.
So you had a group of people that were watching each other.
That's true too. It's kind of like the case of the reading La'ora Ner that we read before, that we're not concerned that the person is going to tilt the lamp if he's reading with other people. That was something we learned earlier. Okay, so now we say so we said that you can light the fire in the Beit HaMoked and the Beit HaMikdash right before Shabbat. Even though normally in a fireplace in your own home, you cannot do that. You have to make sure that the fire is going steadily before Shabbat starts. In the Beit HaMikdash, for the area, the Beit HaMoked, where the Kohanim would warm themselves, that was not a requirement. So, where do we get this from? Amar Rav says, Lo tevaru esh v'chol moshevotechem. V'chol moshevotechem yatam av'ir. Aval atam av'ir b'mdurat Beit HaMoked. That Rav Huna brings the pasuk, Lo tevaru esh. You can't light a fire in all of your dwellings on Shabbat. Which means you can't light a fire in all of your dwellings on Shabbat. But you can light a fire in the Beit HaMikdash. But the problem is that's not such a good pasuk to use. Why? Because Matkif la Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda said, Yachi afilu b'Shabbat nami. According to that pasuk, you should be able to light the fire in the Beit HaMoked even on Shabbat. Because that pasuk says not to light it on Shabbat in any of your dwellings. It's not talking about Friday afternoon. It's talking about Shabbat. So you just said what? You're allowed to light the fire for the Kohanim to warm themselves on Shabbat in the Beit HaMikdash? Definitely not. Definitely not. So that cannot be the meaning of that pasuk. What is that pasuk of Lo Tivaru Esh coming to tell you? It's coming to tell you that you can put the Evarim Updarim, you can put the limbs, the various limbs of the Korbanot on the fire on Shabbat. You're allowed to put them onto the Mizbeach on Shabbat. Now, what exactly this is talking about here, whether it's talking about the limbs of Korbanot that were offered on Erev Shabbat, or it's talking about the ones that were offered on Shabbat, is not entirely clear. But the main point, and the Rishonim argue about precisely what case is being permitted here. Okay, but the point is that is interpreted, B'chol moshevotechem is interpreted as excluding the Beit HaMikdash for the purposes of the Korbanot. In other words, that when it comes to Korbanot, we're not worried that you're cooking the limbs of the Korbanot on the Mizbeach, that you put them on the altar. That's what that pasuk is talking about, even on Shabbat. But so what then is the answer to the question of why we're allowed to light the fire for the Kohanim to heat themselves right before Shabbat? That has nothing to do with Korbanot. There's no special dispensation for that. So what's the answer? Because the Kohanim zirizin hen. Because again, the Kohanim are very meticulous. They know that they're in the Beit HaMikdash. They know they're in the presence of Hashem. They're not going to mess around with the fire on Shabbat. We trust their devotion that they're not going to do that. So that's why in the Beit HaMikdash for the Kohanim they have a leniency that they can set fire to their create their fire right before Shabbat, even if it hasn't become steady yet, and that's okay. But somebody in their own home, we can't rely on that as much. So that's the answer. There's no special biblical basis for allowing them to do it, because that biblical basis is referring to the korbanot and has to do with cases where you might have the hava aminah. You might suppose that it wouldn't be allowed to burn certain korbanot on Shabbat, and it is. So then we said that in Gvulin, outside of the Beit HaMikdash, the rule is that the fire has to take on the majority of the wood before Shabbat. So if you're going to light a fire in your fireplace on Friday, you must start the fire with enough time before Shabbat starts that most of the wood is lit before Shabbat begins. Now what does most mean is going to be the question, of course. My ruban, amar rav, rov kol echad v'echad. What it means is that let's say you have 10 logs. Each one of the 10 logs, the majority of it has to be on fire. Okay, so according to Rav, we don't look at the total number of logs. We don't look at the entire collection of logs. We look at each log. Each log has to be majority on fire. Shmuel is looking at the total picture. He says it has to be lit enough that we don't say, bring some more wood to put in between the logs to get the fire going. In other words, what it means by ruban is that the entire fire is going enough that you don't feel like you need to add anything. So it's self-sustaining, exactly. So that means, in other words, that we're not looking at each individual log, but we're looking at the totality of the fire. Once it's a rolling fire, we're not concerned that you're going to play with it anymore. So that's how Shmuel looks at it. Tanei Rav Chia l'sayoyei l'Shmuel. So Rav Chia brought a braita to support Shmuel, kedei shetei shalhevet ola me'eleha. That and velo shetei shalhevet ola al yedei davar acher. So it says he brings a statement here, and Rashi says he's not exactly sure where the statement comes from, and there was an argument of what is the context of this statement. What's the original context of the statement? What is it talking about? The menorah? Is it talking about some other case? Whatever the case may be, there's another case where we say that the measure of when a lighting is considered to have taken place, and we're assuming it's talking about the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash, is when the flame is olam eleha, when the flame is self-sustaining and doesn't require any more maintenance. So he says, so too here, what Shmuel is saying is, once the fire is self-sustaining and it doesn't require any more maintenance, that's when we say your obligation is fulfilled. And as long as it's rolling to that level, the fire is going to that level, we don't have to worry that you're going to play with it on Shabbat. Etz Yachidi. What if you have one big log? Instead of having a bunch of little logs like most people have in a fireplace, you have one big log. So what's the measurement there? Rav is going to say, Rov ovyo v'amrela b'rov hekefo. That there were two versions of what Rav said. Some students said that what he said was the thickness of the log, the majority of the thickness of the log. In other words, you have to look at the log. It's got dimensions. It's obviously circular, so it's got a circumference. So one says the thickness of the log, which means the fire has to have penetrated through the majority of the thickness of the log. Okay, the other version says, no, it has to be the circumference of the log. The majority of the circumference of the log has to be covered, as Rashi says. Rov hekefo mi bachutz, from the outside is where the fire has to catch on. So how do we measure majority? Do we measure majority by penetrating through the log? Or do we measure majority by going around the log? That's the machloket in understanding Rav. Amar Papa says, since we don't know, we require both. It has to be that it's going around the majority of the log, so it's on both sides of the log, and that it's penetrating through the log most of the way before we'll say so that it's okay for Shabbat. So on Friday, one has to leave enough time to light this log that they have the fire going around the majority of the log and through the majority of the log as well, if they're working with only one log. Actually, this is a Tanaitic dispute. It's a dispute among Tanaim. Rabbi Chia says, "Kedei shishachet ha'etz mimelechet ha'uman that what is the level that's considered that the log is on fire? When it's ruined for being used for any craftsmanship. Okay, a craftsman can no longer make any use out of it. In other words, according to Rashi, what that means is rov ovio. That means that the majority of the thickness of the log, because if the majority of the circumference only, so that's just the outside of the log. So one could still maybe salvage it for work. But if it penetrated through the majority of the thickness of the log, it went through the log, now forget it. It's going to be ruined. So that's what Rabbi Chia is saying. That's the measurement of a log being on fire. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera Omer, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says, what it means is that the fire has to be grabbing both sides. What does both sides mean? The outside of the log. In other words, the outside of the log, as long as the majority of the log is encircled by fire, that's enough. And that's obviously an earlier stage, by the way, because that's the outside still. That's the outside surface still. That's and even though we don't have a proof that this is the measurement of what's considered to be a log on fire, we have a somewhat of a zecher ledavar. We have a hint to it because it says because when it's talking about the destruction that will befall the Jewish people in the Nevuah Yechezkel, it says the fire is consuming both ends. And the inside is dried out. Can it be used for work? So what is it trying to say? It's trying to say that when the fire is already seen on both sides of the log, in other words, it's encircled the outside of the log for the majority, we assume that the inside is already dried out and it can no longer be used. So that's the way that Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera is understanding it. So we have then two different approaches to what is considered a log being fully on fire, and whichever one we take, it doesn't matter, because in the end we view both. We say that both of them have to be met. Both of these standards have to be met in order for the log to be considered fully on fire, and that's the way that Rav Papa ruled. Ve'ach lifanav mivo'aret, and this is a pasuk talking about Yehoyakim when Yirmiyahu sent him the Megillah to read, warning him of the impending destruction of Jerusalem, and he throws it into the flame. It talked about how the flame was burning in front of him. Ma'ach, what is the ach? What does this mean? Amarav achvana, what it means is arava. It means willow branches were burning in front of him. This is what he was using for fire, and this is what he throws the Megillah into. Ushmuel Amar, Shmuel says, etzim shenidliku b'achvana. Achvana means that, like brotherhood. What it means is that these sticks were lit one from the other. In other words, it's not describing what kind of stick it was, that it was willow branch. It's describing that it was multiple branches, small ones and large ones, that were burning together and feeding off of one another.
This is kindling wood.
I guess so, yeah. So there was one person who was asking, who wants achvana? In other words, there was somebody selling in the market who wants achvana, and it turned out he was selling willow branches. So that's what the term technically means. Rav Huna says, kinim and tzrechin rov. That we say that kinim, if you're dealing with reeds, if you're lighting reeds, a fire of reeds, it doesn't require a majority. A majority doesn't have to be lit for it to be considered that the fire is underway. Agadan, if you put them together in a bundle, tzrechin rov, then you need to say that the majority has to be on fire, because apparently the fire wouldn't spread so easily among the reeds when they were together, when you had them in a bundle, as they would when they were laid out separately or just touching one another. When they're in a bundle, it's harder for them to catch fire. Gar'inim and tzrechin rov. Similarly, if you use the pits of dates were used for fuel. You don't need the majority of the pits of the dates to be on fire. Nitanan bechotalot tzrechin rov. But if you put them into a container, they used to put them into a container made of the date palm, actually, of the branch of the from the tree. They would make like the kinds of things that we make for the lulavim. These sort of like little holders. So they would make a little holder that they would put the date pits in it, and they would burn it like that. If it's like that, if it's together, he says, there you tzrechin rov, then you need a majority. So apparently when they're together as a bundle, it's more problematic. We require more.
Well, what I don't understand about the big log is that's not how you light a fire. I mean, you can't light a fire with one big log. You got to have some.
Well, I don't know where they brought the flame from. They brought the flame from somewhere, and they lit the log on fire.
But then the log is irrelevant.
Well, no. Let's say they brought, they rubbed two sticks together.
In other words, there is a fire from some other.
They take a flame and
what is going to
lit it.
sustain the fire
is the log.
And
it still could be extinguished. Let's say wind blows or it flickers out or whatever.
Because I see. Okay.
So that's the concern. So okay, so. Rav Chisda said, wait a second, it seems like the opposite. I mean, why should it be that when they're together, it's more stringent? You would think when they're bundled together, it's going to burn more quickly. So he says, Kinim mivadran, Agadan lo mivadran. Garinin mivadran, nitanan b'chota lo do mivadran. He says because when the things are separated, so maybe the fire won't spread. When they're together, they're not gonna. There's no distance between them. It's gonna spread more quickly. In both cases, Itmar Nami. Similarly, it was stated, although we're going to see it's not exactly similarly because he still doesn't agree with him completely on Kaf Amud Bet. Amar Rav Kana says Kinim shagadan tzrichin rov. That when you bundle the reeds together, he says you need a majority. Lo agadan en tzrichin rov. When you don't bundle them, that's when you don't need a majority. So that's actually agreeing with the first version. When it comes to reeds, he's agreeing with the first version. He's agreeing with the version of Rav Huna, that it's actually more flammable, more readily flammable when they're separate when it comes to reeds. But with garinin, with the date pits, there, garinin tzrichin rov, nitanan b'chotalot en tzrichin rov. There, it follows the intuition of Rav Chisda, that when they're bundled together, they're more flammable than when they're separate. Okay, now you can see here that the Hagaot Agra has a different version where they change all of this around, and he says that actually it should be exactly like what Rav Chisda's objection was, because it says, so too did Rav Kahana say. In other words, that in both cases, when they're bundled together, they more readily catch fire. And when they're separated, they less readily catch fire. So not like Rashi's version and the Rosh's version, that there's a difference between reeds and pits. That pits are better when they're together and less flammable when they're apart. And reeds are the opposite. They're more flammable when they're not bundled, and they're less flammable when they're bundled. According to the Gra, bringing the Rambam and the Rif, their version had it that in both cases, like Rav Chisda says, in both cases when they're bundled together, they are more flammable. Tani Rav Yosef said, Arba madurot en tzrichin rov. There are 4 kinds of flames or fires where we're not worried about requiring that the majority be on fire before it's okay. Because these are fires that become self-sustaining very quickly. Shel zefet. One is of zefet, what's the English word for zefet? It's tar, right?
Tar.
Yeah. V'shel gofrit and sulfur. V'shel gvina and cheese. V'shel revav. Revav, according to Rashi, is any kind of melted substance like fats or melted wax, anything like that that's on fire. It's going to sustain itself. B'matnitatana, we learned also in a Braita, af shel kash v'shel givava, also straw and stubble. Once they catch fire, straw, forget it. It's never going to go out. Rabbi Yochanan said, it seems Babylonian wood doesn't require a majority, meaning Babylonian wood is so flammable that once you light it, even a minute before Shabbat, you could be sure that it's going to take fire. So, Matkifla Rav Yosef says, Maihi, what are you talking about? If you're talking about these small pieces of wood that they used to chop small logs, they would take big logs and they would chop them into small pieces for firewood. If you're talking about that, Ashta Petila, Amar Ula Hamadik Tzarch Shadik Berov Ayotze Siltem Mibaya. Ula said that even a petila, even if you have a wick that's put into oil, we require that the majority of the wick be caught on fire before we're confident that the fire is going to take. So certainly with these small pieces of wood, it should be the same. What's the difference? Why? Just because it comes from Babylonia, you think it's better? Why is it better? Because it comes from Babylonia. If a wick has to be mostly caught on fire before we're sure that it's going to take, certainly a piece of wood is going to be the same. Ela, Rav Yosef explained, what does it mean, Babylonian wood here? Shochad arza. What it means is a branch of the cedar wood. And as Rashi explains, that inside the cedar wood if you take a branch of cedar wood and you take the bark off of it, there's like a woolly substance under there, and some kind of woolly substance, and that woolly substance in between the bark and the actual tree branch is what they would use. It was very flammable, so that once you lit it, you didn't have to worry. It would definitely stay lit. So that's the Sochad Arzah, as we're going to see. It comes later. Rami Bar Abba Amar Zaza. Rami Bar Abba says, you know what we're talking about? Moss. Moss is very flammable. That's what when he said the trees of Babylonia, he meant moss. Apparently they had a lot of moss there. So the green moss is very flammable. And we say, Hadran alach Yitziot HaShabbat, Hadran alach Yitziot HaShabbat, Hadran alach Yitziot HaShabbat. We finish the first parak of Masekhet Shabbat. We'll continue with this second parak. What can we light with on Shabbat and what can we not light with? This is talking primarily about the Shabbat candles, but really any candle. It doesn't have to just be the Shabbat candle, but even if a person had candles, in those days they used candles for all of their light, not just for the formal Shabbat candles, but they would have candles everywhere. And they would not use certain wicks and certain oils because of concerns that these wicks and oils would not take the fire properly. They would flicker and they would cause difficulty seeing, and they would not provide sufficient light. So we're not going to translate a lot of these words because these words are going to be translated in the Gemara. Lo belechesh, not with lechesh. Lo bechosen, not with chosen. V'lo bechalach, which is a type of silk. V'lo beptilata idan, not with a wick of idan. V'lo beptilata midbar, not with the wick of the midbar, of the desert. V'lo biroka shal pnei hamayim, not with the green that's on the water. V'lo bezefet, we cannot use tar. V'lo b'sha'ava, not wax. V'lo b'shemen kik, not with the oil of kik. V'lo b'shemen srefa, not with the oil of burning, which actually we're going to see. All of these have an explanation. V'lo b'aliyah, v'lo b'chelef, not with the fatty parts of the animal, and not with fat. Nachum Amadi Omer. Nachum Amadi says, "Madikin b'chelev mevushal." He says, if you cooked and melted down the fat, you could use it. The Chachamim say, whether it's cooked or not, even if you melted it down, you can't use it. So we're going to see the Gemara is going to explain all of these words in the course of the discussion. That's why I didn't explain a lot of them. Gemara says, lechesh. What is lechesh? Sochad arzah. That is again the cedar branch. Sochad arzah. It's be'almahu. What are you talking about? You're going to use a cedar branch? You're going to stick a cedar branch into your oil to light it as a candle? What are you, nuts? What kind of wick is that? Are you going to take a branch of a tree? No. That means ba'amranita itbe, like we said before. When you take the bark off of the cedar branch, underneath is a woolly substance. You take that woolly substance, you can make it into a wick. But those wicks apparently were too flammable, maybe, to be used as a wick for a candle. So they wouldn't hold the flame steadily, and therefore they shouldn't be used on for Shabbat lighting. V'lo bechosen, what's chosen? Amar Rav Yosef, ne'oret shel pishtan. This is talking about the uncombed flax. When you would take the flax, they would take the flax and they would beat it, and then they would have to comb out all of the these broken fibers that were inside. So the fibers, he's saying that this is talking about the ne'oret shel pishtan. It's talking about the fibers that they would extract from the flax. These fibers shouldn't be used for a wick. The Gemara says, Amar le Abai said, "V'aketiv v'yaya chosen le'ne'oret." It says that the chosen is going to be the ne'oret, that the person that is, now literally what that means is the hechason le'ne'oret, which means that the strong person is going to be like, ne'oret is going to be like as flammable as flax. It's describing how even the strong person is going to be defeated. Now, but the idea here is chason ne'oret is that it's saying chosen. That chosen, the term chosen can't mean ne'oret. The term chosen can't mean the fibers inside the flax, because the fibers inside the flax are not called chosen. Chosen refers to something else. Ela Amar Rabbi, rather Rabbi says, kitna didaik v'lo nafitz. What it means is that when you have flax that is crushed but not combed. In other words, you take flax. What they would do with the flax is after they would crush it to extract all of the extra junk and fibers that were inside, they would comb the individual strands to make them very, useful for twisting or for weaving or for whatever they would use it for. So for sewing, and so we're talking about flax threads that have not been combed. so they're not in the optimal state for use, because they're still tangled, they're still bunched together, they haven't been combed properly. So in that type of flax, you cannot make into a wick, because it's not going to be the kind of wick that's going to be able to hold the fire properly in place. So the Gemara goes on. V'lo b'kalach. What's chalach? Amar Shmuel shaltinu l'chol nechotei yama. I asked all the people who go by the sea, in other words, the travelers. Va'amrei, and they said kulcha shemei, that this is called kulcha, which is silk. Rav Yitzchak bar Zira Amar. Rav Yitzchak bar Zira says gushkera, that this means gushkera, which is some kind of an inferior kind of silk. Okay, Ravin, like the pisolet of the silk, it's considered like the silk that's of a lower grade kind of a silk. So once upon a time, Ravin and Abaye were sitting in front of Ravna Nechemya, the brother of the Rish Galuta, of the head of the exile. He was wearing some kind of a fine silk garment. Ravin said to Abaye, Hainu kalach ditnan. There's the silk that we're talking about. You're not allowed to make a wick out of silk. And look, he's wearing silk, and that's what it's talking about in the Mishnah. Amar le. Abai said to him, Anan shira peranda karinan le. We call that shira peranda. In other words, we call that fine silk. Kalach is talking about garbagey silk, right? The not such good silk, not the good silk. What he's wearing is the fine silk. Maybe there is an objection. In other words, there is an objection to Ravin, because it would seem to be Ravin and Abaye are having a machloket. According to Ravin, even fine silk can't be used as a wick. Abaye is saying, no, the garbage silk is the one that can't be used. Good silk is good silk. The shira peranda, that's good. Because it says, Medve hashirayim v'hakalach v'asirakin chayavin b'tzitzit. So it says that the shirayim and the kalach and the sirikin are obligated in tzitzit. These are different types of silk. And it says the word shiraim and kalach. So obviously, what's called shiraim, what's called the finer silk, is not the same as the kalach. Exactly what Abaye says. Abaye says that there's a difference between kalach, which is inferior grade silk, and the shiraim, which is the fine silk that this guy is wearing. So the Gemara says, you're right, tiyuvta, that is actually a tiyuvta, a refutation of Ravin. But ibait ema, it's possible to defend Ravin and say, ema, shira lechud, v'shira paranda lechud. It could be that there are three grades of silk. There's really good silk, which is the shira paranda. There's the shiraim. There's the silk, which is the average grade silk, and then there's the kalach. So the kalach could be fine silk. These three terms. In other words, there could be two different types of silk, but three different terms being used. Kalach could actually be the fine silk. So when the Mishnah said shiraim and kalach, so it said there's silk and there's kalach. It might not be saying there's good silk and there's garbage silk. It might be saying there's shiraim and there's kalach, very fine silk. So Ravin is saying that kalach means the finest silk. Abaye is saying that it means only the low grade silk. Now we say velo b'ftilat haidan. So what does it mean, petilat haidan? Achvena, that means, like we said before, it's a reference to willow. It's the willow bark. What we would take from the willow, we would extract from the willow. So Ravin v'Abaye havu kazlek bepikta de tamrurita. Ravin and Abaye were apparently like to discuss this Mishnah a lot, and they were once walking in a valley of tamrurita. Chazinu lahanu arbeta. They saw some aravot. They saw some willows. Amar le Ravin Abaye. Ravin said Abaye, Hainu idan ditznan. This is the idan. This is what, when it says ptilat idan, it's talking about this. He said to him, what do you mean? Amar le hahi etz be'almahu. That's just a tree. How are you going to take a tree branch and put it in oil and make a candle out of it? So kalaf v'achvele amranita de beni beni. He showed him just like the cedar bark. If you strip back the bark, you'll see a woolly substance underneath that can be used for petilot, that it can be used for wicks. So too with aravat, with the willow, if you peel back the bark, you will find a woolly substance that can be used, and that is what the Gemara is saying you shouldn't use. The Mishnah is saying you shouldn't use for a wick. So then we said, not with the wick of the wilderness, of the desert, shavra. That's talking about a type of grass called nettle, which was found in the wilderness. What does it mean, the green that's on the water? Are you talking about algae that grows on the water? The green that floats in the water? That just falls apart. You can't make any kind of a wick out of that. How are you going to make a wick out of algae? What it's talking about, Rav Papa says, is the moss that grows on the outside of boats. That's why it's called the green Yiroka Sha'al Pnei Hamayim, because the boat that sits in the water for a long time, it gets that green on the outside. That green, that moss, could be used as a wick, but of course it can't be used. It's not allowed to be used for Shabbat. The point is that these things are made into wicks. They're just not ideal wicks. Tana, we learned from that in addition to all the things mentioned in the Mishnah that you're not allowed to use for wicks, we add to that shel tzemer, wool, v'shel se'ar, and hair. V'tanat didan, and why did our Mishnah not mention these two things? If they're in fact included, why didn't it mention them? Because tzemer machavatz kavetz, because when you light wool, all it does is sort of like contract. It doesn't burn, but the wool itself just starts to contract. Se'ar ichruchei michrach, and when it comes to hair, all hair does is become singed. It doesn't hold the flame. It will just burn. So in both of these cases, our Mishnah didn't think you needed to mention hair or mention wool, because these things obviously are not effective wicks. Forget about Shabbat reasons. In general, they're not effective wicks. Nobody's going to want to use them.
The entire list, the question is, like, the entire list that they have, there must have been a reason to mention these.
These are things that are, right. In other words,
there's a myriad of other ways.
Of course. Well, that's the whole point. That's exactly the point of the end. That there are many substances that could be made into a wick. What the Mishnah is obviously mentioning, the Gemara is for each one of these things, but that can't be a wick, because the point is that each one of the things in the Mishnah must be something that would reasonably be used as a wick. It's just not ideal for a wick.
So these are just examples, or
they're examples,
or they could be things people used to use.
The Rambam, they're things that people. They're definitely things that people used to use. That's why they use the examples. Right. But the Rambam says that they're trying to illustrate a general principle, which is substances that could be used as a wick, but are not ideal. And the light is going to flicker, or they're not going to draw the oil well, or whatever the problem is. This is the problem. So the Rambam says it's really illustrating a general principle rather than being just these examples alone. Velo bezefet, we say zefet is zifta, that's tar, sha'ava, keruta, and sha'ava is wax. Keruta is the Aramaic word for wax. Tana adkan pesul petilot, mikan velach pesul shemanim. So the Tosefta says, up till here we discussed pesul petilot. We talked about wicks that are invalid. Now we start talking, after the word sha'ava, when we start saying lo v'shem and kik, v'lo v'shem and serefa, we're talking about oils now. Okay, we're not talking about wicks anymore. But pshita, that's obvious. If you read the Mishnah, you see that in the beginning we're talking about wicks, and then we switch to talking about oils. Why do you have to tell me that? Because sha'ava itzrichale, because of sha'ava, because of wax. What might you think? That you might think that as a wick it's not good. Kamashmalan. Therefore, it comes to tell you that actually it is good. So what does Rashi say here? That what it means to say is that you might think that as a petila, you're not allowed to use it, but you are in fact allowed to use it. Now the Tosafot says that our wick candles. This is talking specifically, right, not about the wax candles. Tosafot says that we have. The wax candles that we have are good. He says that what it's talking about here is wax that was used like melted wax, to use melted wax as an oil, okay, or to use melted. So the Gemara is saying that you might think that you can't use wax as a petila, even as a wick. In other words, when the wax is hard, when the wax is being used to hold the flame, you might think that you can't use it. And the Gemara is saying you could use it. You could use that. But you can't use it as an oil when you melt down the wax. You can't use melted wax as the oil for your candle. Now the Tosafot here says, B'nei narvona osrin ner sha'ava shelanu. that the people of Narbonne, they didn't allow, and Rav Shrera Gaon, and many of the people from the Sephardic countries, they didn't allow wax candles because of this Gemara, because they said, look, it says that wax, you can't use it, you can only use it as a petilah. You can use it as a wick, but you can't use it as the oil. And when you use a wax candle, the wax is the oil of the candle. Right? The wick on top is what you light. The wax is actually the candle. Now you can light wax by itself. If you put fire on wax, it will take. But but the way that we do it is not that way. So we're using really the wax as the candle. So, and the way that they interpret the Gemara is that it's saying that you can stick a wax petilah into oil and use wax as the wick, but you can't use wax as the oil. However, Tosafot comes along and says that their custom is that you can use wax candles, and wax candles were widely used, and although there was an ongoing machloket throughout the generations about whether wax candles were acceptable, the general practice became to use wax candles for Shabbat. Now we'll just do this very last part here so that we can conclude. Add 2 dots on the top of the next page. So Amar Rami Baravin says, Itrana pesolta de zifta. That what is itrana? Itran is the waste product of the tar. Okay, so whatever comes out of the waste product, when they would take, as Rashi says, when they would extract this from the tree, zav mimenu al yedei or pesul tzalul kashemen. That there would be when they would take the zefet from the tree. So there would be some byproduct of the process. When they would expose it to fire, to purify it, to extract the zefet, there would be a byproduct that was clear like oil. That's the itran. And sha'ava p'solta duvsha. And what is sha'ava? That is the waste product when you extract honey. Right? That's the wax is from the beehive. So lemay nafkamina. Why is he telling us this? Lemekach umimkar. That this is for business reasons. In other words, Rashi says, because somebody who wants to buy sha'ava, wax, all you give him is the leftover honeycombs, basically. You give him the wax from the beehive. You don't have to give him anything else. He might say, no, when I said sha'ava, I wanted, purified, and I wanted it this, and I wanted you to melt it down. No. All that wax is the byproduct. Once you extract the honey, you wipe it off, here's your wax. If you're selling wax, that's all you have to sell. So for monetary purposes, we need to know what is the term sha'ava refer to, so that people don't rip people off in business, and they're honest, and they give them exactly what they pay for. Have a great day.